Danny Martinez wheeled his chair through the heavy wooden doors of the courthouse. The sound of his wheels echoed in the empty hallway. It was 8:30 in the morning, and most people were just starting their day. Danny had been awake since 5. He always got up early now. Sleep didn't come easy anymore. His wife Lisa walked beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. She wore a simple blue dress and had tied her long brown hair back. She looked nervous. Danny could tell because she kept checking her purse for the court papers even though she had already looked at them 3 times in the car. "You okay?" Lisa asked as they stopped outside the courtroom door. Danny nodded. He was wearing his best shirt, a white button-down that Lisa had ironed the night before. His jeans were clean and pressed. He wanted to look respectful for the judge. Even though this was just about a parking ticket, Danny believed in showing respect to the court. The parking ticket wasn't even his fault. Someone had parked too close to his van at the grocery store. When Danny came out, he couldn't get his wheelchair lift down properly. He had to park in a different spot, and the meter ran out while he was shopping. By the time he got back to his van, there was a $25 ticket on his windshield. Lisa had wanted to just pay the fine and be done with it. But Danny said no. He wanted to explain what happened to the judge. Maybe she would understand. Maybe she would dismiss the ticket. It wasn't about the money. It was about being treated fairly. They entered the courtroom together. It was bigger than Danny had expected. The ceiling was high and there were tall windows along one wall. The judge's bench sat at the front, raised up like a stage. Behind, it hung an American flag and a state flag. Danny stared at the American flag for a moment. He had served under that flag. He had almost died for it. "Where should we sit?" Lisa whispered. Danny looked around the room. There were about 20 people already there, sitting in the wooden benches that lined the courtroom. Most of them looked bored or worried. A few were reading papers or checking their phones. Danny chose a spot in the back row where he could park his wheelchair easily. The bench was hard and uncomfortable. Lisa sat down next to him and took his hand. Her fingers were cold. Danny squeezed them gently. "It'll be fine," he said quietly. Danny looked around at the other people waiting. There was an older man in a wrinkled suit reading a newspaper. A young woman with purple hair was texting on her phone. A middle-aged couple sat together, whispering about something. Everyone had their own reason for being there. Everyone had their own story. Danny's story started 3 years ago in Afghanistan. He had been a Marine for 8 years. He loved being a Marine. He loved serving his country. He had done 2 tours in Afghanistan already, and had volunteered for a 3rd. Lisa didn't want him to go, but she understood. Danny felt it was his duty. The explosion happened on a Tuesday morning. Danny's squad was on patrol in a small village outside Kandahar. They were checking on a school that had been built with American money. The children always ran out to see the Marines when they arrived. Danny loved seeing their faces light up, but that day was different. As they walked toward the school, Danny saw something that didn't look right. A pile of trash by the side of the road seemed out of place. He had learned to trust his instincts about things like that. "Stop," Danny had called to his squad. "Something's not right." He was walking toward the trash pile when it exploded. The blast threw him 15 feet through the air. When he woke up 3 days later in a military hospital in Germany, both of his legs were gone below the knee. The doctors said he was lucky to be alive. The explosion could have killed him. It could have killed his whole squad. But Danny didn't feel lucky. He felt broken. He felt like half a man. The next year was the hardest of his life. There were surgeries and physical therapy and learning to walk on prosthetic legs. There were nights when he couldn't sleep because of the pain. There were days when he didn't want to get out of bed. Lisa stayed with him through all of it. She drove 4 hours every weekend to visit him at the Veterans Hospital. She helped him with his exercises. She held him when he cried. She told him he was still the same man she had married. "Daniel Martinez," a voice called out. Danny looked up. A court clerk was reading names from a list. Danny's name wasn't called yet, but he knew it would be soon. He felt his heart start to beat faster. The courtroom was filling up now. More people had arrived while Danny was thinking about the past. The judge still hadn't come out yet. A bailiff stood near the front of the room. He was a big man with gray hair and a serious face. Danny watched as other cases were called. People walked up to the front of the courtroom and stood before the judge's bench. Some had lawyers with them. Others spoke for themselves. Most of the cases seemed simple. Parking tickets, speeding tickets, small stuff. "You think she'll be understanding?" Lisa asked. "I hope so," Danny said. Judge Patricia Williams had been on the bench for 22 years. Danny had looked her up online before coming to court. She had a reputation for being fair but strict. She didn't like people who wasted her time or showed disrespect to her courtroom. Danny respected that. He had served under officers who were the same way. Fair but strict. They expected you to follow the rules and do your job. If you did that, they would take care of you. The big wooden doors at the back of the courtroom opened again. More people came in. A lawyer in an expensive suit walked quickly to the front. A woman with 2 small children found seats near the middle. The children were trying to be quiet, but they kept whispering to each other. Danny remembered being a child in a courtroom once. His father had gotten a speeding ticket and had decided to fight it. Danny was maybe 8 years old. He remembered being scared of the judge. The man had seemed so serious and powerful in his black robes. Now Danny was the one facing a judge. But he wasn't scared. He was nervous, yes, but not scared. He had faced much worse things than a traffic court judge. He had faced enemy fire and explosions and the possibility of death. A parking ticket hearing seemed small compared to that. "All rise," the bailiff called out in a loud voice. Everyone in the courtroom stood up, everyone except Danny. He couldn't stand up. His legs were gone. In their place, he had 2 prosthetic legs that he was still learning to use. He could walk short distances with them, but it was difficult and tiring. For longer trips like this one to the courthouse, he used his wheelchair. Judge Williams entered the courtroom through a door behind her bench. She was a woman in her late 50s, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore black robes and looked very serious. She climbed the steps to her bench and sat down. "You may be seated," she said. Everyone sat down except Danny, who was already sitting. Judge Williams opened a folder and began looking through papers. The court clerk handed her more papers. She studied them carefully. "Good morning, Judge Williams," said to the courtroom. "We have a full docket today, so let's get started. I expect everyone to be respectful and to follow proper courtroom procedures. When your name is called, please approach the bench promptly." Danny felt his stomach tighten. His name would be called soon. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking slightly. Lisa noticed and took his hand again. The morning sun was streaming through the tall windows now, making patterns on the wooden floor. The courtroom was warm and stuffy. Danny could smell coffee from somewhere, probably the clerk's office. He wished he had brought a bottle of water. "First case," Judge Williams said, looking at her papers. "State versus Robert Chen." A young man in a suit walked to the front of the courtroom. Danny watched as he stood before the judge and stated his name. The case was about a speeding ticket. The judge listened to both sides and then made her decision. The whole thing took less than 5 minutes. "Next case," the judge said. Danny knew his turn was coming soon. He took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. This was just a parking ticket, nothing more. He would explain what happened and hopefully, the judge would understand. Everything would be fine, at least that's what he hoped. The cases kept moving forward. Danny watched as person after person walked up to the front of the courtroom. Some looked confident, others looked scared. A few had lawyers with them who did most of the talking. Most people were there for small things like traffic tickets or minor violations. Danny's hands were getting sweaty. He wiped them on his jeans and tried to stay calm. Lisa was sitting very still beside him. She kept looking at the judge, and then back at Danny. He could tell she was worried about how this would go. "State versus Maria Lopez," Judge Williams called out. A woman in her 30s walked to the front. She had been caught driving without a license. The judge was not happy about that. She gave the woman a lecture about following the law and being responsible. The fine was $200. The woman nodded and said she understood. Danny thought about his own case. A parking ticket seemed so small compared to driving without a license. Maybe the judge would be easier on him. Maybe she would see that. It wasn't really his fault. State versus Danny Martinez, the court clerk called out. Danny's heart jumped. This was it. He put his hands on the wheels of his chair and started moving toward the front of the courtroom. The wheels made a soft squeaking sound on the wooden floor. Everyone in the courtroom turned to look at him. Danny had been in his wheelchair for 2 years now, but he still felt uncomfortable when people stared at him. He knew they were curious. He knew they wondered what had happened to him. But their stares still made him feel different, like he didn't belong. He rolled his chair up to the defendant's table at the front of the courtroom. The table was the right height for him to rest his arms on. Judge Williams was looking down at some papers. She hadn't looked up at him yet. Danny positioned his wheelchair so he was facing the judge's bench. He folded his hands in his lap and waited. The courtroom was very quiet. He could hear the clock on the wall ticking. He could hear someone coughing in the back row. Judge Williams finished reading whatever was in front of her. She set the papers aside and looked up, but she didn't look down at Danny. She looked straight ahead like she was expecting to see someone standing there. "Mr. Martinez," Judge Williams said in her clear, strong voice, "please stand and state your name for the record." The words hit Danny like a punch to the stomach. "Please stand." He stared up at the judge, not knowing what to say. The courtroom was completely silent now. Even the clock seemed to stop ticking. Danny felt his face getting hot. Everyone was looking at him. The judge was looking at him. Lisa was looking at him from the back row. The bailiff was looking at him. The court clerk was looking at him. All those eyes were on him, waiting to see what he would do. Judge Williams still hadn't noticed the wheelchair. She was looking at her papers again, waiting for Danny to follow her instructions. When he didn't move, she looked up again. "Mr. Martinez," she said, her voice a little sharper now, "I asked you to stand and state your name." Danny's mouth felt dry. His heart was beating so fast he thought everyone could hear it. He had practiced what he would say about the parking ticket, but he hadn't practiced this. He hadn't thought about what would happen if the judge asked him to stand. Some people in the courtroom were starting to whisper to each other. They could see what was happening. They could see that Danny was in a wheelchair and couldn't stand. But Judge Williams still hadn't noticed. Danny cleared his throat. His voice came out quieter than he wanted it to. "Your Honor," he said, I can't stand." The words seemed to echo in the quiet courtroom. Judge Williams stopped looking at her papers. She looked directly at Danny for the first time. Her eyes moved from his face down to his body, and then she saw it. The wheelchair. The empty space where his legs should be. Danny watched the judge's face change. Her stern expression softened. Her eyes went wide. She set down her pen and took off her reading glasses. The color seemed to drain from her face. "Oh," Judge Williams said quietly. "Oh my." The courtroom was so quiet that Danny could hear his own breathing. He felt like everyone was staring at him, judging him, feeling sorry for him. He hated that feeling. He had worked so hard to feel normal again, to feel like he was still a whole person. But moments like this reminded him that other people saw him as broken. Lisa was gripping the edge of the bench where she sat. Danny could see her out of the corner of his eye. She looked like she wanted to run up and help him, but she stayed in her seat. She knew he needed to handle this himself. Judge Williams put her glasses back on and looked at Danny more carefully. She seemed to be studying him, trying to figure out what to say next. The silence stretched on and on. "I apologize, Mr. Martinez," Judge Williams finally said. Her voice was much softer now, not the commanding tone she had used before. "I didn't realize. Please remain seated." Danny nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." But Judge Williams didn't move on to the parking ticket case. She kept looking at Danny. There was something about the way he sat in his wheelchair that caught her attention. Even sitting down, he had perfect posture. His shoulders were straight, his head was held high, he looked like a soldier. "Mr. Martinez," Judge Williams said slowly, "are you by any chance a veteran?" The question surprised Danny. He hadn't expected her to ask about his military service. Most people didn't ask. They just stared at his wheelchair and wondered silently what had happened to him. "Yes, ma'am," Danny said, straightening his shoulders even more. "United States Marine Corps." A murmur went through the courtroom. Several people sat up straighter in their seats. The bailiff, who had been standing casually by the wall, came to attention. Judge Williams leaned forward in her chair. Her whole attitude had changed. She was no longer the stern judge rushing through a busy court docket. She was a person talking to another person. "How long did you serve?" she asked. 8 years, Your Honor," Danny replied. 3 tours in Afghanistan. The courtroom was completely silent again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence of a few minutes ago. This was respectful silence. People were listening carefully to every word. Judge Williams nodded slowly. "And your injury? Did that happen during your service?" Danny had answered this question many times before. Usually he kept his answer short. He didn't like to talk about what had happened to him. But something about Judge Williams made him want to tell the truth, the whole truth. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "IED explosion. I lost both legs below the knee." The words hung in the air. Danny could hear someone in the back row take a sharp breath. He could see Lisa wiping her eyes with a tissue. The bailiff was staring at him with a new kind of respect. Judge Williams was quiet for a long moment. She seemed to be thinking about what Danny had just told her. When she spoke again, her voice was very gentle. "When did this happen, son?" she asked. The word son surprised Danny. It was the way his father used to talk to him. It was the way his commanding officers had talked to him when he was hurt or scared. It made him feel like someone cared about him as a person, not just as another case on the court docket. "About 2 years ago, Your Honor," Danny said. Judge Williams shook her head slowly. 2 years, she repeated. "And you're here today because of a parking ticket?" Danny nodded. He had almost forgotten about the parking ticket. It seemed so unimportant now compared to everything else that was happening in this courtroom. "Tell me about this parking ticket, Mr. Martinez," Judge Williams said. "What happened?" Danny took a deep breath. This was the part he had practiced. This was why he had come to court instead of just paying the fine. "Your Honor," he began. "I was at the grocery store with my wife. Someone parked too close to my van and I couldn't get my wheelchair lift down properly. I had to find another parking spot, but by the time I finished shopping and got back to my van, the meter had run out. The ticket was on my windshield." Judge Williams listened carefully to every word. She didn't interrupt or look at other papers. She gave Danny her complete attention. "So you're saying you were delayed because of your disability equipment?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Danny said. "The wheelchair lift needs extra space to work properly. When someone parks too close, I can't use it." Judge Williams nodded. She looked like she was thinking about something important. The whole courtroom was waiting to see what she would say next. Danny felt a strange mix of emotions. He was embarrassed about the awkward moment when she had asked him to stand. But he was also grateful that she was listening to his story and treating him with respect. He could see that this judge was a good person who cared about doing the right thing. The morning sun had moved across the sky, and now it was shining directly through the tall windows. The light made everything in the courtroom look golden and warm. Danny felt like something important was happening, something that would change how he saw himself and how others saw him. But he didn't know yet just how important this moment would become. Judge Williams sat back in her chair and looked at Danny for a long moment. The courtroom stayed very quiet. Everyone could feel that something important was happening. This wasn't just about a parking ticket anymore. Danny waited. He had learned patience in the military. Sometimes you had to wait for orders. Sometimes you had to wait for the right moment to act. Sometimes you just had to wait and see what would happen next. This felt like one of those times. The judge picked up her pen and then put it down again. She seemed to be struggling with something. Finally, she spoke. "Mr. Martinez," she said, "I need to ask you something and I want you to be completely honest with me." "Yes, ma'am," Danny replied. "How exactly were you injured?" What happened over there? Danny felt his chest tighten. This was the hardest question for him to answer. He had told the basic facts to doctors and social workers and government officials, but he had never told the whole story in a place like this in front of all these people. He looked back at Lisa. She gave him a small nod, encouraging him to tell the truth. She knew how hard this was for him. She had held him on the nights when he woke up screaming from nightmares about that day. Danny turned back to face the judge. Your Honor, we were on patrol in a village outside Kandahar. There was a school there that had been built with American money. We went to check on it regularly, make sure the kids were safe. His voice was steady, but inside he was back in that dusty village. He could smell the smoke and dust. He could hear the children laughing as they ran out to see the Marines. The kids always got excited when they saw us coming, Danny continued. They would run out and wave. Some of them knew a few words in English. They would say, hello and thank you, and America good. Several people in the courtroom were leaning forward now, listening to every word. The court reporter was typing quickly, trying to keep up. Even she seemed caught up in Danny's story. That day was different, Danny said. Something felt wrong. I had been over there long enough to trust my gut feelings about things. When you're in a war zone, those feelings can save your life. Judge Williams nodded. She had never been in combat, but she understood the importance of trusting your instincts. I saw a pile of trash by the side of the road, Danny went on. It looked out of place. The local people were very clean, very careful about their village. They wouldn't just leave trash lying around like that. Danny paused. This was the hard part. This was the part that still gave him nightmares. I told my squad to stop. I told them something wasn't right. I started walking toward the trash pile to get a better look. The courtroom was so quiet that Danny could hear the air conditioning humming. Everyone was waiting for him to continue. The bomb went off when I was about 10 feet away from it, Danny said. It was an IED, an improvised explosive device. The blast threw me through the air like I was a rag doll. Lisa was crying quietly in the back row. She had heard this story before, but it never got easier for her to listen to. When I woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Germany, the doctors told me both my legs were gone, Danny said. They said I was lucky to be alive. They said if I had been any closer to the bomb, it would have killed me. Judge Williams had tears in her eyes now. She wasn't trying to hide them. What about your squad? She asked quietly. What happened to the other Marines with you? Danny's face brightened a little. This was the part of the story that made it all worth it. They were all okay, Your Honor. Because I saw that trash pile and made them stop, they were far enough away when the bomb went off. The blast hurt me, but it didn't hurt them. The bailiff was staring at Danny with obvious respect. He was a veteran himself, from the Gulf War. He knew what it meant to put your men's safety before your own. So you saved their lives, Judge Williams said. Danny shook his head. I just did my job, ma'am. That's what Marines do. We look out for each other. How many men were in your squad? The judge asked. 7, including me, Danny replied. So 6. Marines went home to their families because of what you did. Danny had never thought about it that way. He always focused on what he had lost, not on what he had saved. I guess so, ma'am. Judge Williams wiped her eyes with a tissue. She looked around the courtroom. Everyone was staring at Danny with new understanding. This wasn't just a man in a wheelchair with a parking ticket. This was a hero who had given up his legs to save his fellow soldiers. Mr. Martinez, Judge Williams said, do you have those prosthetic legs that the VA gives to amputees? Yes, ma'am, Danny said. I have them at home. I'm still learning to use them. They're hard to walk with for long distances, so I use the wheelchair when I need to go places like this. Can you walk at all with them? Yes, ma'am, short distances around the house mostly. My wife helps me practice with them. Judge Williams looked back at Lisa. Is that your wife there in the back row? Yes, ma'am, that's Lisa. Mrs. Martinez. Judge Williams called out, would you please come up here and join your husband? Lisa looked surprised. She wasn't sure if she was supposed to come forward, but the judge had asked her to, so she stood up and walked to the front of the courtroom. She stood beside Danny's wheelchair and put her hand on his shoulder. "How long have you two been married?" Judge Williams asked. 6 years next month, Lisa said. Her voice was shaky from crying. "And you've been with him through all of this? The injury, the recovery, everything?" "Yes, ma'am," Lisa said. "Danny is the strongest person I know. What happened to him was terrible, but it didn't change who he is inside. He's still the same good man I married." Judge Williams smiled at Lisa. "You're both very lucky to have each other." She turned back to Danny. "Mr. Martinez, I want you to know that what you did over there, the sacrifice you made, it matters. It matters to those 6 Marines who went home to their families. It matters to their wives and children and parents. It matters to all of us." Danny felt a lump forming in his throat. He wasn't used to people talking about his service this way. Most of the time, people either ignored it or they said things like, "Thank you for your service," in a way that sounded automatic, like they were just being polite. But Judge Williams was different. She really understood what his sacrifice meant. She saw him as more than just a disabled person. She saw him as a hero. "Now," Judge Williams said, "about this parking ticket." Danny had almost forgotten why he was there. The parking ticket seemed so small and unimportant compared to everything they had just talked about. "You said someone parked too close to your van and you couldn't use your wheelchair lift?" "Yes, ma'am, the lift needs space to come down. When someone parks too close, I can't get out of my van." "And this caused you to be late getting back to your parking meter?" "Yes, ma'am. By the time I found another parking spot and did my shopping, the meter had run out." Judge Williams nodded. She looked at the papers in front of her, then looked back at Danny. "Mr. Martinez, this parking ticket is for $25. Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am. And you drove all the way down here and took time out of your day to contest a $25 ticket." Danny wasn't sure how to answer that. When she put it like that, it did seem kind of silly. "Well, ma'am, it wasn't really about the money. It was about the principle. It wasn't fair." Judge Williams smiled. "You're absolutely right. It wasn't fair. A man who gave his legs for his country shouldn't get a parking ticket because he couldn't use his disability equipment properly." She picked up her gavel and looked around the courtroom. Everyone was still listening carefully to every word. "But before I make my ruling on this case," Judge Williams said, "I want to ask you one more question, Mr. Martinez." "Yes, ma'am." "Do you ever regret it? Do you ever wish you hadn't walked toward that bomb? Wish you had just ignored your instincts and kept walking with your squad?" Danny thought about the question for a moment. It was something he had asked himself many times during the dark days in the hospital. It was something he had wondered about during the long months of physical therapy. "No, ma'am," he said finally. "I don't regret it. Those 6 Marines are alive today because of what I did. They're home with their families. Some of them have kids now. One of them just got married. I get Christmas cards from their families every year, thanking me for bringing their sons and husbands home." He paused and looked around the courtroom. "I lost my legs, but they kept their lives. That seems like a pretty good trade to me." The silence that followed was different from all the other silences that morning. This one was filled with respect and admiration and awe. Everyone in that courtroom understood that they were in the presence of someone truly special, someone who had given everything for others and didn't regret it for a second. Judge Williams set down her gavel and did something that surprised everyone in the courtroom. She stood up. Judge Williams stood up from her chair behind the bench. This was something she rarely did during court proceedings. In her 22 years as a judge, she could count on one hand the number of times she had left her seat during a hearing. Everyone in the courtroom watched as she walked around to the front of her bench. Her black robes flowed behind her as she moved. Danny looked up at her, wondering what she was going to do. Lisa squeezed his shoulder a little tighter. "Mr. Martinez," Judge Williams said, standing now only a few feet away from Danny's wheelchair. "Before we talk about your parking ticket, I need to say something to you and to everyone in this courtroom." She turned to face the people sitting in the benches. About 30 people were there now. Some had arrived while Danny was telling his story. Word had somehow spread that something special was happening in courtroom number 3. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Williams said in a clear, strong voice, "we have a true American hero with us today." A murmur went through the crowd. People sat up straighter in their seats. The court reporter stopped typing for a moment and looked up. "This man," Judge Williams continued, pointing to Danny, "gave his legs in service to our country. He didn't just serve in Afghanistan. He didn't just do his job. He saw danger and he walked toward it, knowing it might cost him his life. He did this to save his fellow Marines." Danny felt his face getting red. He wasn't comfortable being called a hero. He had always thought of himself as just a Marine doing his duty. Heroes were people in movies or in history books. Heroes weren't regular guys like him who just tried to do the right thing. "Because of Mr. Martinez's actions," Judge Williams went on, 6 other Marines went home to their families. 6 mothers got their sons back. 6 wives got their husbands back. Some of those Marines now have children who exist because this man was willing to sacrifice himself for others. The bailiff started clapping. It began as slow, respectful applause, but soon other people joined in. The court clerk started clapping. The prosecutor started clapping. People in the gallery started clapping. Soon the entire courtroom was applauding Danny. Danny had never experienced anything like this. Usually when people found out he was a disabled veteran, they either ignored him or they gave him looks of pity. Sometimes they said thank you for your service in a way that sounded like they were just being polite. But this was different. This felt real. Lisa was crying again. But these were happy tears. She was proud of her husband, but she was also amazed to see him getting the recognition he deserved. For 2 years, she had watched him struggle with feeling like he was broken, like he was less than he used to be. Now she was watching a whole room full of people see him the way she saw him, as a hero. The applause went on for almost a minute. Judge Williams let it continue. She knew this was important. She knew that Danny needed to hear this, needed to feel appreciated for what he had done. When the clapping finally stopped, Judge Williams wasn't finished. She walked back to her bench, but instead of sitting down, she picked up something from beside her nameplate. It was a small American flag, about 8 inches tall, mounted on a wooden base. "Mr. Martinez," she said, carrying the flag back toward him. "This flag has sat on my bench for 15 years. It's not just any flag. It has special meaning to me." She held the flag carefully in both hands, like it was made of gold instead of cloth. "This flag belonged to my father," Judge Williams said. "He served in the Vietnam War. He was a helicopter pilot. He flew medical evacuation missions, going into dangerous areas to rescue wounded soldiers." Danny could see that talking about her father was emotional for the judge. Her voice was a little shaky, and her eyes were bright with tears. "My father came home from Vietnam, but he was never the same," she continued. "He had nightmares. He had trouble sleeping. He couldn't talk about what he had seen over there. But he was proud of his service. He was proud that he had helped save lives." She looked down at the flag in her hands. "When my father died 5 years ago, my mother gave me this flag. She said it belonged on a judge's bench, where it could remind me every day about the sacrifices that people make for freedom and justice." Judge Williams walked closer to Danny. She held out the flag toward him. "Mr. Martinez, I would be honored if you would accept this flag. It should belong to someone who truly understands what it means to serve, what it means to sacrifice for others." Danny stared at the flag. He couldn't believe what was happening. Judges didn't give away personal items to people in their courtroom. This was unprecedented. This was extraordinary. "Your Honor," Danny said quietly, "I can't take your father's flag. That belongs to you and your family." Judge Williams smiled. "My father would want you to have it. He spent his whole life serving others just like you did. He would be honored to know that his flag was going to another hero." She placed the flag gently in Danny's hands. The wooden base was smooth and warm. The fabric was soft but strong. Danny could see that it had been cared for, treasured. "Thank you," Danny whispered. His voice was so quiet that people in the back of the courtroom had to lean forward to hear him. "I don't know what to say." You don't need to say anything, Judge Williams replied. Just accept it with the respect and honor that you've earned. The courtroom erupted in applause again. This time it was even louder and longer than before. People were not just clapping now. Some were cheering, some were whistling. An elderly man in the back row stood up and saluted Danny. Then another person stood up, then another. Soon everyone in the courtroom was standing and applauding. Everyone except Danny, who was sitting in his wheelchair holding the flag and trying not to cry. Lisa bent down and kissed the top of his head. She was so proud of him she could hardly stand it. She had always known he was special, but now everyone else could see it too. Judge Williams waited for the applause to die down. When the courtroom was quiet again, she returned to her bench. But she didn't sit down. She stood behind her chair and looked at Danny. Now, she said, about this parking ticket. Danny had completely forgotten about the parking ticket. Everything that had happened in the last few minutes had pushed it completely out of his mind. But he was still there because of that $25 fine. Mr. Martinez, you came here today to contest a parking citation. You explained that you were delayed because someone parked too close to your van and you couldn't use your wheelchair equipment properly. Is that correct? Yes, ma'am, Danny said. Judge Williams picked up the papers related to his case. She looked at them for a moment, then looked back at Danny. Mr. Martinez, this parking ticket is completely unjustified. A disabled veteran should never receive a citation because he couldn't access his vehicle properly due to inconsiderate parking by another person. She picked up her gavel. I am dismissing all charges against you. Consider this a small gesture of gratitude from your community for your service and sacrifice. The courtroom burst into applause once more. But Judge Williams held up her hand. She wasn't finished. Furthermore, she said, I am directing the city prosecutor to work with the parking authority to create better accommodations for disabled drivers. No veteran, no disabled person should have to face this kind of situation. The prosecutor, a woman named Janet Clark, nodded from her seat at the front of the courtroom. Yes, Your Honor. We'll get right on that. Judge Williams finally sat down in her chair. She looked tired but happy. This had been one of the most meaningful moments of her career as a judge. Mr. Martinez, she said, is there anything else you'd like to say before we conclude this hearing? Danny looked around the courtroom. All these people were looking at him with respect and admiration. His wife was standing beside him, tears of joy streaming down her face. He was holding a flag that had belonged to a fellow veteran, a man who had served with honor just like he had. Your Honor, Danny said, I just want to thank you, not just for dismissing the ticket, but for everything you've done here today. For the first time since I got hurt, I feel like people see me as more than just a guy in a wheelchair. I feel like they see me as a Marine. Judge Williams smiled. Mr. Martinez, once a Marine, always a Marine. And you, sir, are a Marine that any country would be proud to claim. She banged her gavel once. This hearing is concluded, she said. But nobody moved. Nobody wanted this moment to end. Something beautiful had happened in this courtroom today. Something that reminded everyone present about the best parts of being human: courage, sacrifice, gratitude, and respect. Danny sat in his wheelchair, holding the flag, surrounded by the applause and appreciation of strangers who had become, in the space of an hour, something like family. He had come to court expecting to argue about a parking ticket. Instead, he had found something he had lost 2 years ago in an explosion in Afghanistan. He had found his sense of worth. He had found his pride. He had found his place in the world again. And Judge Williams, looking down at him from her bench, knew that this was why she had become a judge in the first place. Not to punish people or collect fines, but to seek justice and to recognize the good in people when they needed it most. The morning sun was now streaming through the tall windows, filling the courtroom with golden light. It felt like a blessing on everything that had just taken place. Danny sat in his wheelchair holding the flag, still not quite believing what had just happened. The applause was dying down, but people were still standing. Some were wiping tears from their eyes. Others were smiling at him. A few were taking pictures with their phones. Judge Williams looked around the courtroom. She could see that everyone had been touched by Danny's story. but she felt like something more needed to happen. Something that would make this moment complete. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "before we move on to the next case, I want to do something that I have never done in my 22 years on this bench." The courtroom became quiet again. Everyone was curious about what the judge was going to do next. Judge Williams stood up one more time. She walked around her bench and stood directly in front of Danny. Then she did something that shocked everyone in the room. She came to attention. Her back straightened. Her feet came together, her arms went to her sides. She looked like a soldier standing at attention. Then, slowly and with great dignity, Judge Williams raised her right hand to her forehead. She gave Danny a perfect military salute. "Thank you for your service, Marine," she said in a clear, strong voice. The effect on the courtroom was immediate and powerful. Several people gasped. Others started crying. The bailiff, who was also a veteran, immediately came to attention and saluted as well. Danny felt like his heart might burst. A federal judge was saluting him. A person in a position of great authority, and respect was honoring him the way one soldier honors another. Despite being in his wheelchair, Danny straightened his back and returned the salute. His form was perfect, just like it had been during his 8 years in the Marines. His voice was strong when he replied, "Thank you, Your Honor. Semper Fi, Semper Fidelis. Always faithful, the motto of the Marine Corps." Words that meant everything to Danny. Words that represented the bond between Marines that could never be broken. The moment seemed to last forever. Judge Williams and Danny looking at each other, saluting each other, honoring each other. Around them, the entire courtroom was witness to something extraordinary. Then other people started standing and saluting too. The court clerk, who had a son in the army, stood and saluted. A man in the back row who was wearing a Veterans of Foreign Wars cap stood and saluted. A woman whose husband had served in Iraq stood and saluted. Soon, more than half the people in the courtroom were standing at attention, saluting Danny Martinez. Some of them were veterans themselves. Others were family members of veterans. Some were just regular people who understood the importance of honoring those who serve. Lisa was crying so hard she could barely see. She had never witnessed anything like this. Her husband, who had spent 2 years feeling sorry for himself and thinking he was broken, was being honored by an entire room full of people. They weren't seeing him as disabled. They were seeing him as a hero. The saluting went on for almost 2 minutes. Judge Williams finally lowered her hand and the others followed her lead. But the feeling in the room didn't change. The respect and admiration were still there. "Mr. Martinez," Judge Williams said, "I want you to know that this courtroom will never forget you. Your story, your sacrifice, your courage, these things matter. They matter to all of us." She looked around the room at all the people who were still standing. "I also want everyone here to remember this moment. Remember that heroes walk among us every day. They don't always wear uniforms. They don't always carry flags. Sometimes they're in wheelchairs, fighting battles that we can't see." An elderly woman in the third row spoke up. "Judge Williams, can I say something?" Judge Williams nodded. "Of course." The woman stood up slowly. She was probably in her 80s with white hair and kind eyes. "My grandson is serving in Afghanistan right now," she said. "He's been there for 6 months. Every day I worry about him. Every day I pray that he'll come home safe." She looked directly at Danny. "Young man, knowing that there are people like you over there, people who would sacrifice themselves to save others, it makes me feel better about my grandson's safety. Thank you for what you did. Thank you for bringing those boys home to their families." Danny felt fresh tears in his eyes. "Ma'am, I hope your grandson comes home safe. I'll say a prayer for him." "Thank you," the woman said, sitting back down. A middle-aged man in a business suit stood up next. "I just want to say," he began, "that I came here today because I got a speeding ticket. I was annoyed about having to take time off work. I was thinking about how unfair it was that I got caught." He shook his head. "After hearing your story, sir, I'm ashamed of myself. A speeding ticket is nothing. What you've been through, what you've sacrificed, it puts everything in perspective." Several other people nodded in agreement. Their own legal troubles seemed very small compared to what Danny had endured. Judge Williams smiled. This was exactly what she had hoped would happen. Danny's story wasn't just inspiring him, it was inspiring everyone who heard it. "Mr. Martinez," she said, "before you leave today, I want to give you something else." She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a business card. "This is the card for a friend of mine who works with the Veterans Administration. His name is Robert Chen, and he specializes in helping veterans get the benefits and services they deserve. I want you to call him and tell him I sent you." Danny took the card. "Thank you, Your Honor. I also want to give you this." Judge Williams said, pulling out a piece of paper. "This is my personal phone number. If you ever need anything, if you ever run into problems with the system, if anyone ever treats you with anything less than the respect you deserve, you call me." Danny stared at the paper. A federal judge was giving him her personal phone number. This was beyond anything he could have imagined when he woke up that morning. "I don't know what to say," Danny said. "Just promise me you'll use it if you need to," Judge Williams replied. "I promise." Judge Williams looked around the courtroom. "One more time. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you all for being here today. You have witnessed something special. You have seen what real courage looks like. You have seen what it means to put others before yourself." She picked up her gavel. "This court is now in recess for 15 minutes. I think we all need a moment to reflect on what we've just experienced." As Judge Williams left the courtroom, people began to approach Danny. They wanted to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him their own stories about military service in their families. The bailiff was the first to reach him. "Marine," he said, extending his hand. "I served in the Gulf War. I know what it's like over there. What you did saving those men, that takes real guts." Danny shook his hand. "Thank you, brother." A young woman with a baby approached next. "Sir," she said, "my husband is deployed right now. He's a Marine too. Knowing there are people like you watching out for him makes me sleep better at night." One by one, people came up to Danny. They shared their stories, their gratitude, their respect. Danny realized that his sacrifice had meaning not just for the 6 Marines he had saved, but for all the families who had loved ones in uniform. Lisa finally made her way to his side. She knelt down beside his wheelchair and hugged him. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered in his ear. "I love you," Danny whispered back. They sat together in the courtroom as people continued to approach them. The morning sun was now high in the sky, filling the room with warm, bright light. Danny looked down at the flag in his lap. He thought about Judge Williams's father, who had served in Vietnam. He thought about all the veterans who had come before him and all the ones who would come after. He thought about the unbroken chain of service and sacrifice that connected them all. For the first time since his injury, Danny felt like he belonged somewhere. He felt like his sacrifice had meaning. He felt like he was still a Marine, still a part of something bigger than himself. As they finally prepared to leave the courthouse, Danny turned his wheelchair around to take one last look at the courtroom. This was where his life had changed. This was where he had found his sense of worth again. Judge Williams had returned to her bench and was preparing for the next case. She looked up and saw Danny looking back at her. She smiled and gave him a small wave. Danny saluted her one more time. She saluted back. Then Danny and Lisa left the courtroom together, carrying with them a flag, a story, and a renewed faith in the goodness of people. They had come to fight a parking ticket. They were leaving as heroes, honored and respected by an entire community. Outside the courthouse, the sun was shining brightly. It was going to be a beautiful day.